They said the sky belonged to men who followed instructions, memorized protocols, and obeyed charts. They said intuition had no place in a cockpit. They especially said women like her, simple, quiet, soft-spoken, could never command the air. Amina never argued. She only listened. Not to them. To the wind. At 8 years old, she had known the shift of weather 2 days before it arrived. She could feel pressure change like a pulse in her skin. By 13, she flew paper planes that never crashed. By 17, she'd landed an ultralight glider in a valley during a wind shear while the instructor fainted in the back seat. She didn't have the right schooling. She didn't come from a military family. But someone, somewhere, had seen her fly and pushed her application through. That's how she landed in Falcon Ridge Pilot Camp. She didn't wear their brands. She didn't talk tough. She wasn't good at salutes or shouting back orders. She was good at silence. That made them suspicious. When she tilted her head before a flight and muttered words like, "The wind's nervous," they laughed. When she closed her eyes during simulations and flew better than them, they whispered. One cadet called her the Whisper Witch. Another one said she was just a fluke who would crash eventually. The instructors didn't hide their skepticism either. They didn't know what to do with her. During one mid-air navigation drill, fog rolled in thick. Visibility dropped to near zero. The instructor shouted instructions through static, but she couldn't hear. She wasn't afraid. She pulled off her headset. She let the silence in. The hum of the engine. The tug of the yoke. The breath of the sky. She tilted slightly right, then left, correcting gently, like her hands were dancing with the current. When she landed back at base safely, the tower was stunned. She thought they'd be impressed. They weren't. The report called her actions reckless and disconnected from official training doctrine. The decision came the next day. Expelled. Conduct incompatible with Air Command standards. No appeal. She didn't cry when they dismissed her. She only stood there, hands at her side, wind curling through the open hangar behind her like it had come to say goodbye. One instructor muttered, "You were never going to make it." She replied quietly, "The sky knows me. You don't." Back at the barracks, no one made eye contact. Some looked relieved. A few seemed confused, like they weren't sure if what happened had been fair. But nobody spoke up. She packed her things into a single duffel bag. No medals, no uniform, no future in flight. Just her and the sound of the wind brushing across the cracked glass of the window. That night she didn't sleep. She stood on the balcony, feeling the direction of the breeze shift twice. Something stirred in her bones. A whisper. Not in words. Just presence. The bus ride out of the base was silent. Empty roads. Storm clouds in the distance. A hawk flew beside the window for several seconds, wings steady, unbothered by the bus's speed. She didn't smile. But she noticed. She always noticed the sky's little signs. Back in her hometown, no one understood why she returned so soon. They asked if she'd failed. She said, "Not exactly." They offered sympathy. She didn't want it. She took a job fixing small aircraft for local delivery services. Engines, flaps, sensors. Machines were easier than people. They didn't lie. They didn't judge silence. She spent her days listening to turbines and wind patterns. Her nights listening to the old stories her grandmother used to tell before she passed, the ones about the sky callers. At first, she thought they were just bedtime myth. People who rode the winds, spoke with storms, calmed tornadoes. But as time passed, those stories echoed louder. The wind began to hum in patterns again, like it was singing just for her. On the coldest nights, it whispered her name. Not always in human tongue, but in rhythm, in breath. Her neighbors said she talked less now, that she'd gone stranger than before. But none of them noticed how the birds circled when she walked outside. How weather seemed to pause before touching her roof. How one time, during a sudden gust, she stepped out to fix a power line and came back untouched, hair unmoved, as if the storm had bent around her. She read about the pilot camp online sometimes. The graduates posted their wings. They celebrated each other. Not one mention of the girl who flew through fog without eyes. The cadet who trusted silence over systems. Her name vanished from the records, erased like a smudge on glass. One day, a new mechanic joined the hangar. Young, sharp, loud. He mocked her at first, called her Wind Lady. But after seeing her balance a cracked stabilizer with a single threaded screw and no manual, he grew quiet. Then curious. Then respectful. He asked once, "How did you know that would hold?" She didn't look up from her tools. "The wind told me." He didn't laugh. Not after watching her work. Not after the fourth time he saw her predict weather without radar. Still, no one offered her a cockpit again. And she never asked. Years passed. Her hands grew stronger. Her silence deeper. But the wind had not forgotten her. It still came when she worked. It still brushed her skin like a message waiting to be understood. She began keeping a journal. Not with words. With sketches, spirals, lines, wind patterns, birds mid-flight, clouds split into symmetrical waves. The notebook made no sense to others. But she understood. She was mapping something. Not the land. The air. One evening, she climbed to the old radio tower outside of town. A storm was coming. She closed her eyes. The wind rushed hard around her, loud and alive. Her hair lifted like a flag. Her feet remained steady. In that moment, she remembered what her grandmother once whispered before her final breath. When the world forgets you, listen closer. That's when the wind remembers. She opened her eyes. Something had changed. Not the world. Her. ChatGPT said. The town didn't ask questions when she stopped speaking to people. Amina became a shadow with purpose, always moving, always watching the sky, always listening. She worked alone at the edge of the airfield where the newer mechanics didn't go. Her workspace was silent except for wind chimes and tool click. People called it the ghost shed. She didn't mind. Ghosts had truth in them. Every day, she fixed things others couldn't. Bent flaps. Jammed rudders. Panels that buzzed wrong frequencies. She didn't use manuals much. Her hands moved before her brain did, guided by something older than instruction. No one trained her this way. She just remembered what felt right. One pilot said, "She tunes planes like they're living." But no one offered her a seat in the cockpit. They came for her work, not her story. At night, she sat by the cliffs with a notebook, drawing air currents. Her fingers traced the rhythm she couldn't explain, like music played on invisible drums. She sensed shifts before the news announced them. Thunder 2 days away. Wind change in the afternoon. Sometimes, the sea birds circled her in perfect formation, 3 times clockwise, like a forgotten ritual. She recorded it all. Then came the dreams. They were never sharp or violent. Just sky. Sky and wind and voices not quite human. Whispers in layered tones, overlapping, urgent but kind. She began waking at specific hours, 3:11, 4:04, always after the wind had shifted direction. Always with a word in her head that wasn't English. She started writing those down too. People began to notice strange things. One delivery drone veered off its path to hover above her shed until she walked out and nodded. A faulty plane failed 3 safety tests, but when Amina walked past, the warning light stopped. A little girl said she saw Amina talk to clouds and they blinked back. No one believed her. But no one entirely laughed either. The town elder, Mama Oduya, watched from a distance. One evening, she approached slowly, barefoot, wind tossing her long shawl. She placed a hand on Amina's shoulder and asked, "When did the wind start speaking again?" Amina didn't answer. She didn't need to. The elder sat beside her, eyes closed, lips murmuring something ancient. "You've heard the calling," she said. "It skipped a generation, but it's back." Amina asked, "Is it madness?" Mama Oduya shook her head. "It's memory. Yours. Ours. The wind keeps stories. We just stopped listening." Over the weeks that followed, Mama Oduya began sharing forgotten histories. Not written ones. Oral. Stories of the sky callers. Ancient people who understood the sky like others understood rivers. They didn't conquer the air. They collaborated with it. There were no instruments then. Just breath, rhythm, and trust. The last known sky caller had disappeared before the war. But signs of their return were marked in wind behavior and bird formations. Mama Oduya believed Amina was the bridge between past and future. "You're not strange," she said. "You're returned." The weight of that didn't comfort her. It haunted her. Because if it was true, it meant she wasn't broken. It meant the academy had failed her, not the other way around. And if that was true, the shame she'd carried for years wasn't hers to hold. That truth cracked her open. She began meditating with the wind. No chance. Just stillness. She'd place her hands against old metal wings and listen, not to the machine, but to the space around it. She could tell when storms were shifting globally, not just locally. Her journal filled with charts that mimicked satellite weather maps, but she had no access to any feed. Just instinct. She started seeing patterns between the voices in her dreams and the real-world pressure systems. One night, a dream arrived so vivid she awoke breathless. In it, a massive storm swirled over the coastline, and she stood inside it, not fighting it, not fleeing, but flying through its heart. At its center was an aircraft. Sleek. Gray. Sleeping. But waiting. She touched its wing in the dream, and it opened its eyes. A name was whispered in the wind. Whisper One. Not a model. A title. She opened her notebook. That name had appeared 3 weeks prior without her memory of writing it. She traced her own handwriting, trying to feel what she'd been hearing. Mama Oduya confirmed the old prophecy. The Whisper One was never a person or a plane, it was a convergence. A moment when sky, spirit, and machine would synchronize to prevent catastrophe. "You think the military builds machines," she said, "but even machines have memory. Energy. They know who should guide them." Amina didn't tell anyone else. She kept working, kept quiet, but the wind around her grew bolder. It no longer whispered. It urged. It moved doors, knocked tools over, danced through her shed in spinning spirals. The birds flew stranger patterns now. Triangles and loops no natural formation should follow. One day, a storm warning spread across the news. A typhoon was forming rapidly off the coast. Evacuation orders came late. Power grids began failing. Air traffic suspended. All major bases scrambled. Amina stood outside her shed, eyes half closed, breathing deep. The wind screamed. Then, suddenly, it stopped, like the entire world inhaled. In that silence, she heard every voice at once, not in language, but in purpose. One clear message among them. It's time. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. She walked to her closet and pulled out her old flight gloves. Dusty, faded, forgotten. As she slipped them on, the wind moved again. Fast, focused, directional. She followed. No second thought. Just wind. The road was broken, littered with fallen branches and loose gravel as she walked toward the hills, where the wind led her. She didn't question the direction. She didn't look back. With every step, the air thickened, like the world was holding its breath before something irreversible. By the time she reached the outer rim of the old military zone, the skies had already turned violent. The typhoon now measured as a Category 5. Broadcasts declared it an unprecedented atmospheric anomaly. Meteorologists struggled to explain the sudden sharp shift. But Amina didn't need a report. She felt it pulsing in her spine. The storm wasn't just natural. It was converging by purpose. Down below the cliffs sat a forgotten military facility decommissioned over a decade ago. No one ever went near it anymore, except the wind. It curved in unnatural ways over that land, always resisting full silence. Amina moved like she was retracing someone else's steps, someone long gone but not forgotten. Fences had fallen. Rusted gates swayed without hinges. The wind whispered again, 3 simple gusts, left, straight. She followed. Behind a cluster of eroded hangars was a large metal door, nearly invisible under layers of overgrowth and salt-stained paint. She pressed her hand against it. No code. No key. Just contact. A deep vibration answered, slow and deliberate, and the door unlocked. Inside, a single aircraft sat covered in layers of gray tarp and dust. But even through that, Amina recognized its shape, the sleek angular silhouette of a sleeping predator. F-22 Raptor. Military grade. Still intact. She approached without hesitation. The wind picked up inside the hangar, despite no openings. The air circled the jet like a ritual greeting. Her fingertips touched the cold metal of the nose cone. A hum responded. Not mechanical. Resonant. Like recognition. She walked around it slowly, hands skimming along the faded insignia. The cockpit hissed softly, unlocking itself. Inside, everything was dormant but whole. Most of the digital interfaces blinked red or remained unlit. Amina sat in the seat like she'd done it 1,000 times. Her fingers moved instinctively over the controls, not to power it by force but to awaken it. The HUD flickered. Systems ran diagnostic. Fuel borderline. Power flickering. Communications offline. Avionics semi-operational. Every report said, not flight ready. Still, she reached for the throttle. Nothing happened. She closed her eyes. She listened. Outside, the wind surged, knocking debris against the hangar doors. Inside, silence. Then, one gust pierced through a rusted window pane and rushed through the cabin like a breath of life. The cockpit lit up. One green bar. Then another. Engines clicked into standby. She placed her hands on the controls again. This time, the screen read, ready. Far off, radios screamed across the airwaves. Military frequencies scrambled. 2 jets lost in the storm. 1 evacuation convoy stranded near the flood zone. No flyers able to breach the wall of wind. Pilots grounded. Drones blind. A dozen lives hanging in limbo. A government base issued a last call. We need someone in the air, anyone. But no one answered. Because no one could. Except her. She pulled the canopy close. The hiss of the seal sounded final. Her breath calmed. Systems aligned. The plane, long silent, now purred beneath her like a loyal beast. The runway outside was broken. No lights. No guidance. But the wind pressed against the hangar doors with increasing force, like a tide ready to burst. She flicked the last control. The hangar doors creaked, then roared open. With one surge of power, the F-22 leapt forward, cutting through shadow and rain into the open sky. The landing gear lifted seconds before the broken asphalt vanished beneath her. She wasn't flying by protocol. She was flying by instinct and something else. Guidance that defied reason. She soared into the wall of the typhoon. The clouds were alive, snarling and layered with unpredictable current. A standard pilot would have panicked. Even automated systems would fail. But Amina didn't resist the turbulence. She leaned into it. She moved with the rhythm of the storm, not against it. Lightning illuminated the cockpit every 3 seconds, but her vision remained focused. She made micro-adjustments without thinking. Her ears rang with pressure differentials. Her heart beat in perfect time with the oscillating wind patterns. One wrong move and she would drop from the sky. But she didn't. As she entered the storm's eye, static cleared enough for the radio to catch fragments of desperate messages. Convoy trapped on ridge. Child in critical condition. Any aircraft respond. She aligned her path to the last known coordinate. Her display showed nothing. She didn't need it. The wind pulled her slightly east. She followed. Below, a narrow mountain path lined with broken trucks appeared. A landslide had cut off retreat. A new wave of wind hit her from behind, so strong it should have tipped her. Instead, it stabilized her descent. She toggled to the emergency broadcast frequency and spoke, her voice clear, even. This is Whisper One. I see you. Hold your position. You're not alone. No one responded right away. Then a shocked voice. Identify yourself. She didn't. She just banked low, dropped 2 emergency beacon packages with light flares and food, then punched the engines and climbed again. Above, 2 military jets attempted to re-enter the storm. She heard their chatter. Unknown aircraft in restricted zone. Visual confirmation, F-22 model, but ID not matching. Who the hell's flying that thing? She ignored them. Instead, she diverted course toward the coast where another aid aircraft, low on fuel and failing altitude, was trying to stabilize. The pilot was panicked. Autopilot's shot. Fuel almost gone. No ground visual. She radioed calmly. Adjust heading 5 degrees west. You're flying against the current. Let it carry you. He hesitated, then followed. 5 minutes later, he broke through the cloud barrier and landed safely on a coastal strip. His voice broke on radio. Whoever you are, thank you. She never replied. She circled back, rising through the final updraft. Lightning struck within meters of her wing. She didn't flinch. Her body and the jet moved as one. The storm no longer resisted her. It opened for her. A corridor formed through cloud walls, like the sky had remembered its promise. She flew out just as the worst of the typhoon struck land behind her. The military jets never caught her. Radar lost track. Reporters would later say the signal vanished midair. But the survivors all remembered the same thing. A strange voice guiding them, a fighter that flew like it was born in the storm, and a pilot no one could name. A legend took flight that day. And the wind carried her name again. The storm behind her had sealed off the coastline, cutting communication, isolating towns, and rendering satellites unreliable. Yet the wind remained clear in its direction, flowing ahead of her like a living thread through the chaos. Amina gripped the throttle, eyes forward, the F-22's control panel glowing in soft blues and greens, occasionally blinking but still functional. She was flying without authorization, without military protocol, without any identification or flight clearance. And yet, she was the only one in the sky who could move like this, inside a storm that had paralyzed every pilot with rank and training. As she rose higher into the thinning air, the flight tower near the base caught her signal again. The chatter increased. Unregistered aircraft, identify immediately or you will be intercepted. Another voice broke in, strained with disbelief. Sir, telemetry confirms it's a decommissioned bird. F-22 tail series matches a jet mothballed a decade ago. A third voice, colder and more commanding, said, then someone's reactivated classified hardware. If she breaches base perimeter, shoot her down. She heard every word. She made no response. Instead, she accelerated. 2 jets were scrambled, sleek and modern, cutting through the clouds at maximum speed. They locked onto her coordinates with heat sensors and proximity tracking. The first pilot came close, within 1,000 meters, and initiated verbal contact. Unknown pilot, you are in restricted airspace. Descend immediately or we are authorized to engage. She whispered a single word. No. Then the wind surged beneath her wings. What followed was not a dogfight, but a dance. She banked left at an angle none of their simulators could predict. She twisted through wind pockets the computers refused to acknowledge. Her altitude dropped so fast the pressure nearly crushed her chest, then leveled out inches above mountain ridges, the tail of her jet splitting fog like a blade. The jets behind her tried to mimic. They couldn't. One dropped off. The second stalled and had to emergency reroute. Her signal vanished from their radar as she cut through wind fields like ink through water. On the ground, soldiers scrambled. Commanders demanded answers. Who is she? But there was no name. No data. Only silence and an invisible trail of controlled impossibility across the sky. She descended toward the coast again, where radio chatter from trapped villagers was growing desperate. A second convoy had failed to reach the relief line. Flood waters were rising. One woman was begging through static. My son, we're stuck on the roof. Please. Anyone. Please. Amina angled the jet downward and engaged the infrared scan. Her interface blinked erratically, but her senses didn't. She felt the direction in her chest, pulled not by logic, but by alignment. She throttled forward and skimmed the waterline, eyes scanning rooftops. There. A family of 5 stranded on a warehouse top, water already swallowing the bottom floors. With no tools but flares and instinct, she initiated a maneuver no F-22 manual had ever recommended. A looped flyby with minimal thrust, just enough to ignite a tracking flare from the undercarriage, dropping it within 20 feet of their position. Bright orange fire danced on the water surface. Emergency services caught the beacon. A rescue chopper rerouted instantly. Minutes later, the family was airborne. She never waited to see the end. She was already rising again. At 40,000 feet, she hovered in a cold void between cloud layers, silence thick as fog. The sky around her opened like a cathedral, hollowed by light and absence. No one had ever reached this altitude in these conditions without oxygen support or AI stabilization. But she was calm. The jet trembled once, then stilled. The wind here didn't scream. It whispered. Not in symbols. Not in words. In understanding. You are not the pilot. You are the path. Her breath slowed. Below, in the control towers, radar operators stared in silence as her signal returned briefly, then soared vertically at a speed far beyond the aircraft's rated threshold. Engineers argued. It should have torn apart. But it didn't. Because she wasn't flying by technology anymore. She was flying by alignment. At the edge of the storm, just where the darkness met morning light, the F-22 burst through into open sky. The tail left a long streak of cloud-woven condensation that shimmered like glass. A photo captured it from the mountains below. Later, it would circulate online with one caption: "She flew through the impossible." That same morning, 3 grounded pilots from the academy stood in disbelief, staring at the airspace above them. One of them remembered her. He didn't say her name out loud, but he whispered it was her. It had to be. Back at Central Command, a private conference convened. They tracked the path, traced every maneuver, and ran simulations. Nothing could match it. Not even AI. When asked for identification, the only black box data retrieved recorded a few scattered words. The final audible transmission before vanishing completely: "The sky doesn't belong to you." No signature. No call sign. Just a truth no protocol could erase. Amina continued flying. Not as a fugitive. Not as a hero. But as someone fulfilling a role larger than identity. The people who needed her never saw her face. They only heard a voice when all others failed, felt wind clear when it should have crushed, and saw a shadow pass across the sky like an answer to a question they didn't know they were asking. She didn't seek thanks. She didn't land. She flew because the storm still moved. And she wasn't finished. News channels scrambled to frame the event. No name. No rank. No official clearance. Yet there she was, an F-22 flying through a superstorm, pulling off maneuvers impossible even by war-tested pilots. The footage captured by amateur cameras on the ground showed nothing but streaks of metal slicing through the sky, vanishing, reappearing, then leading rescue signals out of the disaster zone. In boardrooms and war rooms, the question echoed: who taught her to fly? Aviation analysts called it a violation. Defense officials called it a breach. But among the public, she became something else, a symbol. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some called her a rogue AI, others believed she was part of a secret government experiment. But the villagers, the survivors, and the elder who had once laid hands on her shoulder, none of them questioned it. They knew. The wind had finally chosen a voice. Under pressure, the military launched an investigation. The tail number of the aircraft matched one decommissioned 12 years ago. It had been reported non-functional, stored for parts, and forgotten. Yet it had flown, and flown better than any of their new fleet. When questioned, the original technician team denied ever restoring it. Security footage from the base archives showed nothing. Just a storm surge, a flicker in the power grid, and then the jet was gone. Then came the whisper from a former cadet, now stationed at Falconridge. He had recognized the movement, the way the jet banked, cut, surged through unnatural angles. Only one person had flown like that during simulation years ago. She had no combat record, no name in the graduation book, because she had been expelled. Quietly, erased from all promotional archives, he remembered the insult they used behind her back, Wind Witch. Internal inquiries were launched. The files from her expulsion were retrieved. Redacted reports, contradictory witness statements. One flagged entry described her as unstable. Another noted unnatural weather prediction ability. The final evaluation called her a risk to flight formation consistency. A senior official, reading through it now, narrowed his eyes and said, "This is what we called heresy in another age." The media got wind of it. A leak hit the news, a clip from years ago of her guiding her aircraft blindfolded through fog. No sensors, no voice in her ear. Just her and instinct. The video had been buried, never aired, suppressed by command. Now, millions watched it in stunned silence. The fallout was immediate. Reporters stormed the gates of the academy. Veterans questioned the integrity of command. Advocacy groups demanded accountability. An entire wave of ex-cadets who had also been silenced began speaking up. One woman said, "They told me emotion had no place in the sky." Another added, "They called it intuition like it was a disease." Amid the rising noise, the academy finally held a press conference. A stone-faced officer admitted the expulsion of a cadet years ago based on what he now called non-standard talent expression. He never said her name. He never apologized. But the words he used, unjust, regretful, avoidable, were enough. That night, people left white feathers at the gates of the airbase. A symbol. A statement. The sky didn't belong to steel and uniforms anymore. It belonged to whoever could hear it. In her village, Amina watched the broadcast in silence. She didn't smile. She didn't react. She simply stood outside as the wind curled around her, tugging gently at her sleeves. Mama Oduya sat beside her, nodding slowly. The world is catching up. But Amina wasn't interested in fame. She didn't care about vindication. She cared about the shift. The way people started to ask new questions. Not who taught her, but what else had they forgotten? Across the country, schools began integrating oral histories into their physics curricula. Flight programs held workshops on ancestral wind reading. A new generation of young girls, many of them from villages like hers, were being invited to try flight simulators designed around sensation, not just instruction. She was invited to speak. She declined. She didn't want to be a speaker. She had already said everything that mattered with movement. The academy, desperate to redeem itself, offered her a full reinstatement, a commendation, and a post as chief aerial tactician. She didn't reply. They sent a delegation to find her. She wasn't hiding. She was at the same repair shed by the airfield, tuning an old crop-dusting plane. When the officers entered, she simply looked at them. One extended a hand, rehearsed apology loaded in his voice. She didn't take the hand. She asked a single question. "Do you know how to listen to the wind?" He hesitated, then said, "We're learning." She nodded. "Then we're fine," and walked away. Later, an official report reclassified her as non-traditional air asset. Another described her as a case study in instinctive aeronautics. But the people called her something else, the one who listened. Her name remained unofficial, but her impact rippled outward. Not everyone celebrated her. Some called it superstition. Others labeled it lucky coincidence. But the children knew better. They imitated her in the fields, stretching their arms, leaning into breezes, whispering into the sky. Some said the birds flew lower around them now. Some said the clouds moved differently when they played. The world had changed because she flew. Not because she asked it to. Because she answered when the sky called. And because, when they shut every door, she still found her runway. In her silence, a truth had landed louder than thunder. Word spread across flight schools, forums, and bases. Not the official version, those were sterile and stripped of spirit, but the real story. The one whispered from one young cadet to another, from village elder to skywatcher, from mechanic to pilot in training. They spoke of a woman with no name, no badge, no permission, who flew an F-22 through a typhoon and vanished before they could thank her. No one knew where she went, but her presence lingered in radar echoes and airfield rumors. A new group of recruits entered the training cycle at Falconridge. Among them were faces that never would have made it in before, first-generation girls from coastal towns, young men from wind-farming villages, others raised on stories instead of simulations. Their acceptance letters were quiet admissions that something had shifted. Some instructors welcomed the change. Others resisted, muttering about discipline and tradition. But the air around the base had changed. The cadets weren't just learning flight anymore. They were learning attention, listening, feeling pressure shifts, cloud movement, the weight of silence before the wind turns. A former instructor, once part of the board that expelled her, stood at the edge of a classroom now redesigned. On the whiteboard was a single phrase: "The sky doesn't wait for protocol." He read it every morning, wondering when exactly it all slipped past him. In the coastal village, Amina lived simply. The old shed had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not a shrine, but a space to learn. She didn't advertise. She didn't refuse. People found her. Sometimes by wind. Sometimes by word. And when they did, she didn't teach flying. She taught stillness. She asked one question: "What does the wind feel like to you?" Answers varied. Some said music, others said breath, some said pain, some said memory. She nodded at every response. There were no wrong answers. Only deeper listening. Her most persistent visitor was a girl named Zuri, no more than 16, sharp-eyed and restless. Zuri didn't care about official training. She cared about what Amina had done, not how. She wanted to know what it felt like to fly when everyone said you couldn't. Amina didn't answer. She simply pointed at the sky. It's not about defiance. It's about alignment. The wind doesn't follow you. It reveals you. Zuri stayed for weeks. She learned how to sit in storms without fear. She learned how to map airflow without tools. She began to recognize pressure changes by the shape of bird flight. Then one day, as a test, Amina handed her a broken glider. Zuri rebuilt it by touch, stripped it down, reshaped the wings, and flew it off a low ridge without ever asking permission. The air caught her like it was waiting. That night, Amina said, "Now you know what they could never teach." Elsewhere, change unfolded slowly. A military commission opened its doors to indigenous historians and meteorological elders. Flight instructors began pairing barometric data with oral weather wisdom. A new curriculum emerged, one that didn't separate science from spirit, that treated intuition as a form of trained attention rather than superstition. They called it applied aeroperception. Others just called it the whisper method. In a quiet ceremony untelevised and unattended by press, an old F-22 was pulled from the edge of the base and restored, not to fly but to remember. On the underside of the cockpit, someone had engraved one sentence in silver etching: "She flew because the sky remembered her." Amina was never asked to validate it. She didn't need to. One evening, as the tide shifted, she felt a pull in her chest again. Not urgent, just aligned. She walked to the cliffside and saw Zuri waiting with a question in her eyes. Amina nodded. Together, they entered the old hangar, where a newer aircraft stood. Not a machine of war, but a glider designed with hybrid materials. Lightweight, flexible, resistant to industrial arrogance. It had no weapons, no target systems, just wind-reactive wings and a seat made for two. They took off without ceremony. Below them, villagers stopped to look up. There was no roar, no blast, just grace in motion. They moved like memory. one mind guiding, the other receiving. The glider twisted through layered air like it belonged there, like it had waited years for this particular flight. In that moment, something shifted again. Not a revolution, not a riot, but a realization. That flight, in its purest form, wasn't about command. It was about connection. That leadership wasn't always loud. That legacy wasn't always written. Zuri landed the craft an hour later without guidance. No tower, no controller. Just instinct. Amina didn't say much. Just placed her hand on the nose of the glider and whispered, "This one listens well." Around the country, similar gliders began testing. Some crashed. Some flew longer than expected. But none were mocked for their methods. The engineers who once laughed at wind talk now asked how to design for it. One even said, "Maybe it's not about building better planes. Maybe it's about building better listeners." For the first time in decades, flight school applications surged from places the recruiters had never looked: fishing towns, mountain ranges, dry salt plains. Kids who knew the sky without being told. Kids who didn't want to conquer air, just to understand it. Amina watched it all from a distance. She never claimed the movement. She never needed credit. She was just one voice among many. But the wind still carried her name now and then, passed softly between leaves, coastlines, and cloud breaks. Not as legend, as reminder that the wind never forgets those who listen. And that sometimes flying isn't about going higher. It's about going home. 2 of 2. The morning sun rose behind thick clouds, diffusing light across the high cliffs where wind met land like two old storytellers. Amina sat still, hands folded, watching the horizon as though it held a final word meant just for her. The journey hadn't ended, it had simply matured into silence. The world around her had changed in rhythm, shape, even tone, but not in spirit. That had always been the constant. The spirit was what whispered first, long before she ever touched the throttle or sat inside a cockpit. The spirit had come in wind, in dreams, in the soft voice of ancestors. And it remained now, patient and vast. Whispers of her deeds still floated through airfields and classrooms. Cadets recited maneuvers that mirrored hers. Instructors once rigid now taught with flexibility. Manuals once final were now marked in pencil. Students sat on rooftops between lessons to feel air pressure on their skin, tracing wind patterns not as forecasts, but as conversations. No official credited her by name. Yet every page smelled faintly of her presence. She was invited, more than once, to headline global aeronautics conferences. A government rep came personally, offering honors, rank, and compensation for past oversights. She listened carefully, nodded politely, then returned to repairing a torn wing on a child's wooden glider. Some called her ungrateful, others called her elusive. But those who had truly watched her fly knew the truth. Amina did not move for applause. She moved for alignment. The pilot camp that had once expelled her now bore a mural on its southern wall. A nameless figure, arms wide, body floating between wings of air. Below, the inscription, "You cannot erase wind with ink." No one dared take credit for the artwork. It had appeared overnight. The commander chose not to remove it. Instead, he placed a bench nearby. Some cadets prayed there before exams. Some just sat. In remote regions, a subtle cultural shift rippled outward. Children who once hid their gifts now shared them. Girls whose instincts had been mocked for being too soft, too strange, too emotional were now encouraged to explore them. Indigenous weatherkeepers were asked to co-author environmental policy brief. Sky traditions, long buried beneath radar systems and technological dominance, returned, not to replace science, but to deepen it. Still, Amina remained where she had always belonged, not in conference halls or media panels, but in wind-touched corners of the world, where the sky still whispered like it did before language had rules. She became a mentor without schedule. She guided not with lectures, but with presence. Her students found her when they were ready. Some came with questions. Some came with broken machines. Some came with silence. She welcomed them all. One boy, no older than 10, arrived with nothing but a drawing, a crayon sketch of a woman flying over mountains. He handed it to her without a word. She smiled and handed him a small compass. Not for direction, but for feel. "You'll know where to go," she said. "Your chest will tell you before your eyes do." The boy returned 3 years later in a hand-built craft, wings uneven but spirit certain. He crash-landed on the field behind her shed. When he emerged, dirty and laughing, she handed him tea and said, "Your glides will grow smoother with patience." He nodded and said, "I didn't come for smooth. I came for true." Word by word, soul by soul, the world leaned closer toward inclusion, not because it was instructed to, but because it remembered what had been lost in the noise of command. True leadership rose not from dominance, but from deep listening. Mentorship became a sacred thing again. One that asked more of the mentor than prestige. It asked presence. The military quietly revised its archives. Her name was returned to the records, marked with a note, expelled under flawed evaluation. Later identified as unregistered pilot responsible for Typhoon Corridor intervention. It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening. One of her former evaluators, now long retired, sent her a letter. Not with defense or excuse, just a simple line. "I see now what I refused to learn then. Forgive my blindness." She never responded. The wind carried what needed to be said. The young woman she had once trained, Zuri, became a force of her own. She traveled from community to community, teaching flight not with instruments, but with embodiment. Her methods baffled traditionalists, but her students flew straighter, responded faster, and, more importantly, felt more. Zuri never claimed to replace systems. She merely expanded them. "The sky has room for both steel and song," she would say. "But you must learn both languages." Amina watched with quiet pride. She had never sought a legacy. But what she left behind was more than memory. It was motion. A shift in what people believed was possible, not just in flight but in understanding, in leadership, in truth. She had taken the pain of rejection and turned it into a compass for others. She had taken silence and made it powerful. She had taken the storm and used it not to destroy, but to reveal. And as more girls found their wings, as more boys stopped fearing softness, as more elders were asked to speak again, the world grew more whole. In the final days of her visible journey, Amina stood alone once more on the cliff. She didn't fly. She didn't move. She simply felt. The wind was gentle now, not as loud as when it first called her. It no longer urged or pulled. It just waited beside her, patient, familiar. She closed her eyes. A shift passed through the trees. Somewhere far below, a child launched a handmade glider. It soared farther than ever before. And the wind carried it, not with force but with trust. Because the woman who once flew through storms had already changed the sky forever.